Welcome to the meeting of the Libertarian Alliance, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to have Dan Lester, who's going to give us a talk on some critical comments on Long 2013, why Libertarians believe there is only one right. And over to you, Dan.
Thank you. I've recently adopted what I call impersonal text, so I just refer to the text when I'm writing seriously. So Long 2013 refers to the particular paper, though when I'm reading through and discussing it, I might drop that and start talking about Long, just because it sounds a bit odd to keep talking about the Long 2013. This is his paper, which he's had in draft, as far as I can see, for years online. I keep reading it and keep objecting to it. I thought, when's he going to get it published? Because I want to reply to this. And then after a while I thought, well, it is published. I mean, I keep seeing it online. That's published. You know, he can't, if I reply to it, he can't say, oh, I wasn't ready. It's been there for years. Not only has it been there for years, but I've sent him a version of this. So he knows what my criticisms are, and he didn't deem them worthy of condescending to a reply. So, introduction. The main criticisms of Long 2013 also apply to many other libertarian texts. They involve the following three main ideas. One, a non-moral pre-proprietarian theory of interpersonal liberty as the absence of proactively imposed costs. Two, critical rationalist libertarianism. And three, causal and conceptual compatibilism concerning liberty deontologism and welfare consequentialism. Comments. The main thesis of Long 2013 is stated thus. Libertarians believe that there is fundamentally only one right, the right not to be aggressed against. Perhaps this is what most libertarians might say they believe, but something more like the right to liberty has to be the fundamental libertarian right. Or why are they libertarians rather than anti-aggressionists? But how is the right to liberty best theorised? To be clearer, it is better to separate one, a relevant theory of liberty, from two, a relevant theory of a right. One answer about libertarian theory, and possibly the only explicit answer, I haven't come across another, is that it is the non-moral, pre-proprietarian absence of proactively imposed costs. Moreover, aggression itself requires proper theorising in any case, and presumably in some way that is relevantly compatible with libertarian liberty, if it is not to clash with that liberty. Therefore, non-aggression, even if we take non-aggression as our definition, presupposes some anterior theory of libertarian liberty, whether implicit or explicit, albeit that the two things are intimately and even inextricably related. Two, one answer about rights is that these are whatever ought to be regarded as strong prima facie claims towards other people in the real world. But some such rights are best left as strong moral claims, while others need to be enforceable. For instance, a family member or friend has only a moral right, outside of any explicit contract, to more assistance from us than a random person. Or someone has a moral right to what we promised them, although there wasn't even an implied contract. However, everyone ought to have an enforceable right to liberty, even when it flouts non-enforceable moral rights. Of course, one could stipulatively restrict the use of rights to enforceable rights, and this is what Long appears to do. But that would be producing a persuasive definition that flouts the broader common usage for no real gain, as far as I can see. Long asserts that the libertarian position comprises two distinct claims. Something that's a bit odd here, that he's sort of laying down what libertarians believe, especially as I'm a libertarian and I don't agree with what he says, right? You'd think he might say, this is what I think, but no, this is the libertarian position. First, we have a right not to be aggressed against. Call this the positive thesis. Second, we have no other rights. Call this the negative thesis. It might be clearer and more accurate to say the following. First, we only have an enforceable right to interpersonal liberty, but such liberty needs some theoretical explanation. The right not to be aggressed against is possibly an equivalent way of expressing this right, but this relationship needs to be theoretically explained. Second, there are no other rights that enforceably override the right to liberty, but there manifestly are other kinds of rights. We are then told a crucial feature of libertarian political theorising is the insistence that not just the precise nature, but the very existence of political authority requires justification and cannot simply be assumed. But this is obviously false, because it's not the case with critical rationalist libertarians, such as myself and possibly some other people in this room. If critical rationalism is the true epistemology, then justification is impossible and assumptions are inevitable. But criticisms and defences are possible and desirable. Critical rationalism can be explained very briefly as follows. All observations are theory-laden assumptions. We cannot perceive reality directly. All arguments rest on and thereby amount to assumptions, and all valid arguments are tautologies. Logically, we can never support or justify assumptions because of an infinite regress or circularity or an arbitrary stopping point. Assumptions, therefore, cannot give epistemological support, and we cannot get beyond assumptions. Therefore, the only logical epistemological position is testing and criticism to try to detect false assumptions, but the whole process remains within the framework of conjecture. To ask a critical rationalist to justify his assertion is analogous with asking an atheist to name the true religion. A critical rationalist can sometimes usefully explain his assertions, some of their implications and background, logical and empirical, but that explanation would itself make assumptions and be incomplete. Then there is the suggestion that we can start from the basic natural rights that human beings would have in any social context, including a state of nature. Now, however well tested and criticised it is, it can only remain a conjecture that the enforceable right to interpersonal liberty is desirable. An attempt to base that right on nature looks as though it might be some combination of the justificationist error and the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is that something remains essentially what it originally was. For instance, a hen is really a kind of egg. The question is posed, how then are rights to be defined? Now, this is a very odd thing for a philosopher to ask. I expect non-philosophers to ask this question, to define your terms. This is a typical non-philosopher's mistake. For the following reasons. Philosophy should not be about how things are defined, because this suggests one of the following three things, at least one of the following three things. One, we are concerned about mere words. But words don't matter. As Hobbes said, words are wise men's counters. They do but reckon by them, but they are the money of fools. Or two, we are searching for some common usage, but that is unlikely to solve a real philosophical problem, so what would be the point of that? Or three, we are producing a stipulative definition. This is what I mean when I use the word, but that means it isn't refutable, and that can't be a solution to a philosophical problem. It's just Humpty Dumpty definition. Hence, it might be better to say that we are theorising about what rights really are, which is metaphysics, or ought to be, which is morals. We are then offered a very strange view. This is an article that he's had and rewritten over the years, and he must have got criticisms of it. But this, here we go. Libertarians can never leave the Nazis alone. They have to throw them in somewhere, and this is his go at the Nazis. The permissibility of enforcing a right does not entail the permissibility of exercising that right. I have the right to publish and distribute Nazi propaganda. It would not be permissible for me to exercise that right. But nevertheless, it would be permissible for me or my agent to fend off by force anyone who proposed to suppress that right. God knows what he means. The use of permissible is confusing, to put it mildly. If you have a right to do something, then exercising that right must be legally permissible, assuming that the positive law doesn't flout the natural right or whatever, even if it's not morally permissible, according to some moral theories at least. A clear distinction between moral rights and enforceable rights seems needed, and that's what he's ruled out at the very beginning. He's defined rights in terms of enforceable rights, and so he's forced to get to this slightly weird way of talking, where apparently he's going back on what he said, because he seems to be using it in a moral way. We then come to an explanation that unwittingly advances a persuasive normative thesis as though it's a conceptual, factual thesis. Aggression and force are conceptually linked. Aggression is initiatory force, or conversely, force is that mode of conduct which, if initiated unilaterally, counts as aggression. An act of theft can charitably be interpreted as an aggression, in the sense of invasion or trespass against the legitimate owner. But it need not involve any literal physical force, except in the irrelevant sense that physics uses the term. Also, a policeman might defensively initiate force against a thief who had himself used no force by online fraud, for instance. Lacking an explicit and coherent theory of liberty, much libertarian literature unwittingly uses force and coercion in technical, eccentric and persuasive senses that tacitly presuppose and thereby cannot explicitly explain interpersonal liberty. This error is then emphasised in a footnote. It should be noted that aggression, as used here, is a descriptive concept, not a normative one. Therefore, this critical reply might need to be similarly emphasised. If we take aggression is initiatory force literally, then it is descriptive but inaccurate. If we take aggression is initiatory force to mean what some libertarian texts mean by initiatory force, then it is tacitly normative by presupposing that only violating libertarian property rights, whatever they are, counts as initiatory force. That same footnote continues that the term aggression has pejorative connotations, but asserts this derives from the recognition that what the term describes is, in fact, evil. And so this adds, without explanation, the thesis that evil or immorality is factual or positive, which is a denial of the fact-value distinction just thrown in to an essay which is supposed to be philosophical and presumably is thought about. Why do libertarians think there is a right to liberty or a right not to be aggressed against? We are told that some libertarians accept this thesis on primarily deontological grounds. Other libertarians accept the thesis on primarily consequentialist grounds. However, it ought to be added that critical rationalism accepts the thesis on no grounds whatsoever, simply holding it as an assumption or conjecture for criticism. Moreover, it is also possible to conjecture that human liberty and human welfare do not systematically clash because they are systematically complementary in a variety of conceptual and causal ways. We are later told that the ban on positive rights derives from conceptual constraints inherent in our negative obligations, not from any privileging of negative obligations over positive ones. Is this true? Does it even make sense? Libertarianism means respecting liberty, or non-aggression, if you will, as an enforceable obligation. And if you assume such an obligation, then it logically follows that some other potential obligations are ruled out. However, it is conceivable instead to make respecting liberty a weak moral obligation and make, say, promoting universal health care or whatever you like, an enforceable obligation. Therefore, libertarianism is, in this way, exactly about privileging liberty as a negative obligation. It's the only one that's enforceable. Nevertheless, and why do we choose it? Nevertheless, there is no sound criticism for not doing so. We should privilege it, but we shouldn't deny that that's what we're doing, because all the alternatives do not withstand serious criticism. How does initiatory force relate to property rights? Long says, we are committed to recognising, as instances of initiatory force, some forms of interference with one's control over external resources, even if no bodily assault on one's person is involved. But if some forms of interference constitute initiatory force, then it must be permissible to interfere with them. Hence it follows that we must also recognise some forms of interference that do not constitute initiatory force. In short, we are committed to a system of property rights. That is, a set of principles determining when one may and when one may not interfere with a person's control over some external resource. What this passage in effect does is finally and simply admit that the assumed concept of initiatory force needs to presuppose a system of property rights. But that entails that the basic right itself is itself really a system of property rights. The basic right is not the right not to be aggressed against, because every system of property rights has that. Within itself, an act of aggression is whatever interferes, whatever system of property rights is being assumed. Consequently, this is, as it stands, propertarianism rather than libertarianism, though a particular form of propertarianism. Undoubtedly, what is intended is a system of property that respects general libertarian intuitions, but there is no way to explain this philosophically without a proper theory of libertarian liberty, which Locke does not have. Fortunately, there is one. It is a version of interpersonal liberty in the general sense of not being interfered with by other people, or, to elaborate, of being free from other people initiating constraints on us and our projects. Therefore, effecting any proportional defence or restitution ipso facto does not initiate such constraints. This abstract sense of liberty does not and need not mention or presuppose property or morals. Grasping the general mean is more important than the precise way to theorise it. The fact that there has to be some such theory of liberty before property, so that we can evaluate which kinds of property are libertarian. However, for reasons of clarity and precision that will not be discussed here, one theory is the absence of proactively imposed costs, which crucially entails the practical libertarian policy of minimising proactively imposed costs when there is a clash. This view of liberty can be applied to derive self-ownership and external property in a non-normative way. If we avoid a host of philosophical issues, then this can briefly be outlined as follows. In the first instance, in practice, it does not significantly proactively impose on other people to take control of one's own body, and it does greatly proactively impose to take control of other people's bodies. Hence, each person's control of his own body follows if there is to be maximum liberty. And having secure control of one's own body is de facto self-ownership. Asserting that this is moral or lawful in positive or normative sense, in practice, these are entirely separate matters. After that, it minimises proactive impositions for people to be allowed control by use of external resources and thereafter control by trade. And that secure control is also de facto ownership. If people were not secure self-owners or could not have such secure ownership by use and later by trade, then they could be objectively, proactively imposed on by other people to a high degree. Efficient economising and even personal safety would not exist. One way of understanding all this is that libertarian liberty tends to internalise externalities, as economics calls this, but here used in a pre-proprietarian sense. And that also, incidentally, helps to explain why liberty is so productive. Efficient economising is possible and the tragedy of the commons is avoided. Thus, such theorised liberty can be seen in practice to entail self-ownership and external property. There is no need to fall into the error of muddled, moralised and propertised persuasive definitions, an error that many critical texts rightly perceive in libertarian texts such as Long's, but wrongly cite as an inherent flaw in libertarianism. At least perceiving that relevant property rights are required, Long's only suggestion is this: libertarian property rights are famously governed by principles of justice in initial appropriation, justice in transfer, and justice in rectification. This realises that only libertarian property rights can do what is needed. Unfortunately, none of the cited principles is connected to liberty as such in any way that is explained. Moreover, these principles are conflating the issue of justice with what is libertarian as a matter of contingent fact, whether it is just or not. However, as has just been explained in outline, it is possible to derive what libertarian property objectively is under assumed realistic circumstances. In concluding, Long makes a claim to have shown only the following three things. I quote these three things and then immediately reply. 1. Whether or not the positive thesis that we have a right not to be aggressed against is true, there is certainly nothing mysterious or one-sided about finding such a thesis plausible and attractive. The account of aggression as initiatory force is mysterious. Libertarian texts usually have a good tacit understanding of liberty or non-aggression, but a poor explicit theory. Philosophical texts lack a good excuse, especially when they ignore what has been explained in criticism of them by email. 2. Given the positive thesis, the negative thesis that we have no rights other than the right not to be aggressed against necessarily follows, and so there is nothing mysterious or one-sided in embracing it. We libertarians are so reasonable, you see. Why can't they just see? What they're saying is so bizarre, so straightforward. This is the delusion. As the positive thesis is mysterious about aggression and one-sided about privileging non-aggression, that transitively makes the implied negative thesis also mysterious and one-sided. And, in any case, there are non-enforceable rights. Therefore, not only one right. 3. Given the positive and negative theses, the libertarian view of property rights is more defensible than the welfare statist view. And so there is nothing mysterious or one-sided about preferring the former to the latter, about preferring libertarianism to welfare statism. As they stand in Long 2013, there is no philosophical connection between the positive and negative theses and the libertarian view of property rights. So that is one reason that it is mysterious and one-sided to prefer the libertarian view of property rights to the welfare statist view. Moreover, if the libertarian view of property rights were to lead to general deprivation and misery, while the welfare statist view were to lead to general flourishing and happiness, then it would also be mysterious and one-sided to prefer libertarianism to welfare statism. But that is what welfare statists do assume. Hence, they do find it mysterious and one-sided, and they are not long to do so. Conclusion. The general philosophical approach to libertarianism taken in Long 2013 is not at all unusual among libertarian texts. And the general perception of the problems with that approach is not at all unusual among critical texts. To the extent that the delusion of clear argumentative superiority clashes with the accurate perception of argumentative confusion, this makes libertarianism appear illogical and cultish. As a consequence, libertarianism is being held back. I blame the philosophers. But as we have seen, this is unnecessary. The philosophical criticisms can be clearly and cogently answered. Thank you.
Is there any questions or criticisms, David?
Can you describe to those who are not entirely familiar with it what you mean by a proactive imposition? And can you think of a phrase that's a bit less clunky?
I wish I could. I mean, proactive rather than reactive. Initiating an interference. That's why I say, I actually, in the most recent thing I've written, I said, I invite anybody to come up with a better way, a better form of words, because the form of words doesn't really matter. But it's a way of saying, yeah.
Start by elaborating on the meaning so that students can get a sense of what your intended meaning is.
You've got to get a way of what it means for people not to interfere with each other. An irrelevant way of not interfering. So it can't be interfering because they're just rectifying previous interference. And anyway, I sort of boxed myself into a corner of saying, I can't think of anything better than proactive imposition. And it's not reactive, because that's okay, because they started it and you're just putting it right. But you don't go too far, of course, and then you'll start a new impression on proactive imposition yourself. An imposition...
how do we recognise it? How do we recognise objectively?
Sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it isn't. And of course it's always within a history, so that just because you see two people behaving in a certain way, you can't necessarily assume that one is the aggressor, because you don't know what happened immediately before that or long before that, or how, perhaps that what he's got in his hand is stolen and the other guy's just taking it back again. So it's not obvious, but the idea of people, as it were, interacting voluntarily as far as possible, I suppose that may be it. As far as possible, interactions should be voluntary. Is that way of putting it? But then when you come to elaborating it, some kind of technical definition seems to be necessary, because you can't just do it with... Maybe you could go a long way on just maximal footprints.
One might say that the contrast to voluntary interactions is the use of force. Well, then you're getting back to a meaning which you're, I think, trying to get away from, which is libertarian, which is the underlying libertarian theory is that the use of aggression or force is wrongful. But you want to get away from that.
Because there's not necessarily any force in an involuntary interaction. I mean, I pick your pocket, there's no force involved.
I agree with that.
But that's so you don't need to get into force. I wonder if you can. I've never really thought long and hard about it, but I mean, maybe you can just go a long way on the basis of maximising voluntary interactions, and that a perfect libertarian society would be where all interactions are voluntary, but that's probably not going to happen because I want this resource and you want that resource, so we've got to come up with a rule about, say, first come, first served or whatever, and then after that, voluntary. So voluntarism, I suppose voluntarism is the single word which most people would understand. Maximising voluntarism. That might not be adequate technically, but it seems to be a very good mnemonic that really captures libertarianism.
Another question, but I'll wait until it comes.
I was going to just quickly jump in. Would it help to sort of make clear that aggression, the word we use today, comes from the old Latin word aggredi, which means to move or to advance. And so with aggression, you've really got a situation where you've got an initial state of peace, and someone moves or acts in some way that creates a conflict. And then as long as you've got a conflict going on, you're no longer in that state of peace. And what you really want to do is to get back to your initial state of peace in order to try and restore voluntary interactions between people. Does that help at all?
I don't think etymology really matters, because it's just words. But
they are clarifying ideas.
But I mean, the idea of there are some times you can move somebody away from a situation which is what they want, but
people do say
they agree
peaceful voluntary interactions to almost synonymous.
Well, peaceful
Maybe
voluntary interactions is boxing matches are very peaceful. So, but it's voluntary. So as I said, so as soon as you start getting longer than voluntary, you start getting into other areas. And well, that has to be. This is one reason why the harm principle is no good, because you can't try and define it in terms of harm, because people have a right to harm themselves, and you to interfere to stop them harming themselves and say, no, I won't. I know I'm drinking too much. Leave me alone. That can't be. You can't define liberty as minimising harm. You can define paternalism using some such principle, but harm is just no use at all to libertarians. I mean, any alternative technical formulation, I'll have to think long and hard about. But I just think it's a handy single word, voluntarism. I think everybody has some conception of that. And then if you could say, well, what maximises voluntary interactions? Obviously, if I don't interfere with your body without your permission, you don't interfere with my body without my permission, and it extends to the physical world and how we appropriate. I mean, I wonder if the thing is, what counts as voluntary and involuntary. At some point, I've a sentiment, that an intuition that you couldn't get very far without starting to introduce technical terms. But I haven't done it, so I can't be sure.
Yes, Bob?
I don't want to come over all Sternerite here, but I will.
So you do
I think I enjoyed it. Of course, I started with philosophy and Popper and the rest of it, and I haven't departed from all that side. But it seems to me it does simplify things markedly if you move over to economics. In other words, you find people with private property, you
Yeah.
You see how trying to do without it is not a very sensible idea.
Yeah.
Given you're starting with things and the people seem to have acquired it reasonably enough, inherited it in a reasonable manner, what are the sort of rules you should not depart from?
Yeah.
Oh, we find we have some useful rules regarding it, and perhaps some not useful rules. Perhaps we find we have governments. Oh dear. They seem to have a war against private property in a way. So, in a sense, though philosophy is important, and whether libertarian philosophers get it wrong, but rely on people such as you,
Yeah.
and there are non-libertarians who get it very wrong in philosophy, and we also rely on people such as you. But there is another way of coming at it,
Yeah.
which is to explain what sort of world you want to live in. So it may be a bit selfish, but I'd like to live in a world while I'm living of a certain kind, which we're not quite in yet. And when I depart, I'd like the people to come after me to live in a world of that sort. And then you explain the sort of property rights system that would maximise opportunity, which is where I've come.
Yeah.
I've come in a way, or opportunities that should be maximised in a sense. Opportunities that can something. Of course, you have to come back to some value fact kind of thing.
Yeah.
Then perhaps we fall back upon you. But most people are simply impressed by getting the economics right. They're not going to be, oh wow, I've read his paper, I'm a libertarian. Oh, well, you might, especially if you're a philosopher.
I mean, a lot of people, for them, the economics is enough. But the problem, in which case there is no problem for them.
No.
But the problem arises when somebody else has a philosophical criticism that they can't answer.
Yeah.
Other than saying, well, it looks like it works. And then they say, no, but I want an answer to my philosophical criticism. Now, I mean, in a sense, economics is more important than philosophy, but only in the sense that dustmen are more important than doctors, maybe. Because if there were no dustmen, we'd all go to be in trouble very, very quickly, but we could probably go for quite a long time without seeing a doctor. So there's a lot that the economics can do. But not just the economics, there's the history. You can just look at the history of it. And there's, to some extent, there's the sociology of it. I'm not denigrating any other areas, they're just not out. They're outside my specialism. My problem is with the people who, like David Friedman, insist that it has to be all economics. In which case, I think he's wrong, because he's got philosophical critics that he can't answer, and because he can't answer them, they are not going to become libertarians, because they require philosophical answers to their philosophical criticisms. So it's necessary, for the conjecture to defend itself at whatever level is required. I mean, some of it might be economic calculation argument, some of it might be history, what actually happened. Sometimes it's philosophy, that's all. So I'm quite happy with the idea that economics does a lot of work.
Anyone else discuss that? David?
I seek practical advice on this. One of the things that I find so difficult with libertarian argument is that people make some criticism, make some observation. People will be starving in the street if X. And very often, I think, well, I can't really answer this without going right back to the beginning of the theory and the whole framework. And so I just don't answer.
Well, can you give me an example of what?
Yeah, well, you can probably think. I mean, you.
Well, I mean, people have
they
have a whole barrage of theories normally, and if to attack one, they've got all kinds of others that fit together.
In your society, the very poor, disabled people will have some horrible lingering death because nobody will look after them because there won't be a welfare state to look after them and they can't afford it, type thing.
I think you can answer that pretty quickly, but it would, but not necessarily convincingly.
What sort of answer would you give?
I mean, my
Would you give
first
a sort
answer-
of meta answer, or would you give a little
I mean, if
sort of focused
well,
answer?
that's not one necessarily where philosophy would come in. It's one where empirical economics come in, because of the compound opportunity cost loss of state intervention. We are living in a society which is technologically backward and extreme poverty compared to where we would be, say, in this country, if there hadn't been a state for even just the last 20, 30 years. It's like we're living in that. If we saw what we would have had.
Let me stop you there.
Yeah.
I entirely agree with that, and I think it's an incredibly persuasive argument, but that is exactly my point. Which is that is a meta-argument. It's the effect of statism, the effect of having a political world, is that in the long run we are all poorer to such an extent that even the poorest people in a free libertarian society would be wealthier, so much wealthier than they are. But all
As we
that,
see in
but that is a meta. It's a big argument. It's dealing with what appears to be a fairly sort of focused objection, and saying, well, the effect of a statist world is as follows.
Well, I mean, sometimes a broad answer.
It may be the only way to argue. It may be the only way to argue. I'm just seeking guidance as to.
Well, I mean, the advantage of that answer, we always go for the bold conjecture. It covers more ground, and
then somebody says, "Well, I don't agree with you that in a world without a state, we will be better off. We'd be much worse off."
Yeah.
And then you're immediately into. I'm not a bad thing, but you're then into. You've gone from that little debate about the poor disabled person lying there with no legs to the whole debate about.
It's a short answer. Do you think you're alone in being concerned for such people?
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
It's a question in morality, the answer in morality. Yeah. You just come back and say, so you wouldn't give anything to charity then? And they're going to...
I mean, it's not a proper answer.
Well, that's another
aspect.
Another aspect is I read once that people give about 7% of everything they have to charity, and if they had more, that 7% would be more, and the worry would perhaps be that you create a market for paupers, because 7% is a lot of money, and I think there'd be... when you
So, there's a
you're
supply
a bit
of every
hard-headed
demand.
on this because the bleeding heart leftists, just no matter how much money you give them, it's never enough.
When you talk
People need more. This woman, she must be allowed to have her 12th child and move into a bigger house. Oh, no, she mustn't. No, at some point you've got to say no. You cannot have it. There have to be consequences to what you do up to a point. Otherwise, you fill the world with fools if you protect everybody from their folly. So there is a point where prudence and morality, you've got to put your foot down and say,
when you talk about charity, you've got to bear in mind charity is very wasteful. Charity is at best zero sum. And it's not as wasteful as politics, which of course is negative sum. But it is at the cost of trade, which of course is positive sum. So charity is almost as bad as politics, and politics is, let's face it, and let me scotch the fact value distinction. Politics is positively evil.
A few weeks was a talk at the LSE. Professor Gaston came to talk about capitalism in terms of Ayn Rand, and he was a very good speaker. I mean, I loved the way he spoke. Didn't necessarily agree with what he had to say, and at the end, somebody asked him a question. He said, Native Americans had the land until people from Europe arrived.
Yeah.
What's the justification in taking away land from the original owners of that land? To which his response was, they didn't register it.
With the white foot.
I would have a slightly different answer. First of all, you can't own an entire continent just by wandering about a bit on it. And also they didn't create the land. It was already there.
It's already there, but it's
So they have some right to some of it, but you can't say the entire continent is there just because they wander around on it.
Why not? Because you've got people around in what are called towns, here and there, why are they earning any more than someone wandering around?
Well, anyone who then is making their life there, living there, they've got their friends there, their family there, their possessions there, has exactly the same rights to live there and carry on peacefully there as even the people whose ancestors come from that area. Because all of our ancestors ultimately come back from Africa anyway. It's then a dispute between new immigrants and older immigrants. It's not really anything. If you're in an area and you're making your life there, you've got all the rights to occupy that space peacefully that anyone else has, regardless of where you were born.
So, okay, so shall we say you're a wanderer, a gypsy, shall we say, and you're making your life very well, thank you, on this bit of land that somebody thinks they own, because generations of other people have been there before, and their family held this land before. Now along come gypsies and say, well, hey, we use this land better than you were, we claim it now.
Well, that's a case of someone moving in conflict with an initial case of peace, and someone comes and starts a fight. You've got no society between these two different groups. There's no voluntary cooperation going on. And they either need to find a way to voluntarily cooperate, or one of them's going to have to go. It's just like if a wild animal roamed into your area and suddenly started attacking you. You can't negotiate with it. You can try to negotiate with it, but ultimately, when it comes down to a fight between two parties that aren't cooperating, one has to go.
Exactly right. Not with humour, though.
I suppose we're starting a separate conversation. But I think we ought to be liberal and allow a certain amount of exchange. But the speaker's already complained to me, so perhaps I'm neglecting I apologise for neglecting my duties as chairman there. But still, is there any more questions to the speaker?
I have one question.
Yeah.
He said that in the thesis, he says that you have a moral obligation somehow more to family members than you do a stranger,
Yes.
somebody. But that's not a particularly universal way of looking at morality. I know it's, you can argue back and forth, but basically it doesn't really make sense to me. Like, let's say your family member does something wrong to you, or somehow aggressors on your property, and you no longer like them, you no longer have. There is no moral obligation.
Well, that would be different. I mean, other things being equal.
It depends on your system of morality. It's like completely subjective.
Yeah, but I'm saying that, I mean, given most people's systems of morality, or the ones that we happen to have in this country, most people do, if your brother asks you for a favour, you know, he's got some claim because he's your brother. It's not a very big favour, for instance, and you'd benefit him greatly. Then he's got some say, you know, I'm your brother, haven't I got? You think we'd understand he had some greater right to a favour than a stranger.
I wouldn't say it's a right though, really. I think that's right.
Well, you said it wasn't a legal right.
It's not
I think it
illegal,
is
but
moral.
it's morally right.
It's certainly morally right. I mean, this is Socrates versus the idiot who was going to condemn his father, wasn't it? And Socrates spinned it out how he, you know, and of course this was the fellow we was talking about. Said the original apologies that he started the apology. The fellow we was talking about was trying to be what we might call politically correct insofar it didn't matter whether it was his father or not. But I think if you want an example of what is not morality, posing as morality, anything in the political correct credo, and a sort of universalism, you get into the politically correct credo. But what we actually get in actual, I think there is by one objective morality, just like I think there is one objective physics, except that the physics is material, like, and the morality is what you might call immaterial. But yeah, that's opened up a big can of worms. Going up there to, you know, it requires a talk in itself, I suppose. So I might deliver next time. But the point is this: that I think there is one morality, and I think there are a set of rules. And again, the conjectures of refutation sorts out the actual rules that we all basically tacitly know anyway. And I think we know that the person at the beginning of the apology, I think it is, who makes this case against his dad, is in fact something of a prig, to say the least. But it's very more fair. I shouldn't have chairman speak.
Fair enough.
David?
It's
follows on from the chairman's observations, if I direct a question at the speaker.
Yes.
In accordance with propriety. There is an absent friend who I have heard say that libertarianism is a complete moral theory. That is to say that it accurately describes the entire content of that is moral. And that the notion that there is a set of moral rules outside of libertarian theory is on the wrong or incoherent. I may be misattributing to the absent friend his view.
I don't think you are.
I think it's something like that.
Yeah.
I'm just
But,
curious
I mean,
to know what you think about it.
there are two immediate aspects to this. One concerning other people, and the other concerning other species, for instance. Does this mean that it can never be wrong to be gratuitously and extremely cruel to an animal if it's yours? It seems to me that it can. But it's not part of libertarianism. It's just it is extra. So we have to think libertarianism is just not. It doesn't give you the answer to all of moral problems. You can't just say, oh well, let's see what libertarianism says they are. It does go a lot. It actually solves a lot more than most people think. But there are other issues, including animal. I don't think there are any animal rights. I don't think that it makes sense to say that animals have rights, because animals can't have rights because they can't enter into any kind of a tacit contract to behave themselves, which is what you need to do to get a right. But there's certainly wrong things that you can do to an animal, and I don't see how that relates to libertarianism. However, that said, there are things that there are libertarian ways of dealing with cruelty to animals that might be sufficient to deal with that problem, to do with ostracising people who are gratuitously cruel and so forth, might be quite sufficient. Otherwise, if we're dealing with other people, if you were to say, your mother's on your deathbed, on her deathbed, calling for you to come and see her, and you know she's dying, and you think, well, she's not going to be able to change the will now. I've got another little coming to me, so go down the pub. I don't think you've done something wrong there. I mean, it's within your libertarian. Nobody should be able to force you to go and see her, but anybody who does that is some kind of weird, heartless bastard. It's just not behaving in a decent human way. But that's libertarianism doesn't tell him what libertarianism doesn't say. No, you should go and see your mother. So I don't see how libertarianism can be the total of morality. But what's more important as a separate issue is, though libertarianism can be moralised, it's very important always to bear in mind that there's something which liberty is, and it always has to be a separate question whether what liberty entails or allows is moral. It can't be that libertarianism is inherently immoral. Sorry, it's inherently moral or immoral. There's something that liberty is, it's a sort of monomania that which I suppose Long is going in for, in a way. There is only one right. Well, there's only one enforceable right. I mean, that's what we ought to say. But then I think it makes sense to say, well, these other, you have a friend has some right to expect that you just don't leave him to walk home a 10-mile walk because you're chasing some girl or something. I can't think of a better example. But, a friend has a right to all kinds of things. That's just a friend. Nothing on paper, no contract. It shouldn't be enforceable, but in a sense he has a right. Not enforceable right. That's all it means when it says I have some right. It means I have a moral claim. That's all the right is. It's a moral claim. Some moral claims are enforceable. Some moral claims aren't. Right? Libertarians think that only moral claims involving liberty are enforceable, and the other ones shouldn't be. but they still are moral claims. I mean, that's thus far they are rights.